ncIMPACT is made possible by funding from Civic Federal Credit Union. ncIMPACT is a production of UNC-TV Public Media North Carolina in association with the University of North Carolina School of Government.
We're not going to arrest our way out of this problem.
If you can't make bond, you sit in jail, regardless of your innocence or guilt.
I think I cried for like 3 days straight. In my mind, I'm like, I'm gonna be here forever.
We want to be smart on crime, not soft on crime. We want to be smart on crime.
Education, jobs, health, all these issues affect you. Leaders from across the state, people just like you, are working to make things better. The question is, could you do this in your community as well? I'm Anita Brown-Graham. This is ncIMPACT. Every day, thousands of North Carolinians are stuck in jail, not because they've been convicted of a crime, but simply because they cannot afford to pay the bail for their release before trial. Many argue our current pretrial system does little to keep our community safe, and it places a burden on not only the poor, but taxpayers as well. An innovative pretrial release program is taking place in Haywood County. Let's look at the impact of this program and how it could help change the pretrial practices across the state.
In 2013, I got arrested and I was charged with like elderly abuse and credit card fraud and things like that. Originally my bond was $10,000, but the judge raised my bond to $30,000. When I went back upstairs, I think I cried for like 3 days straight because I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, I'm gonna be here forever because I don't have $3,000 laying around to pay a bondsman. I lost my job. I lost my housing because I had Section 8 at that time. So I sat in jail for 2 months. They dismissed my charges and was like, you're free to go.
We want to hold folks pretrial if they're either a risk of flight or safety to the community, or both, not on your ability to pay. We were able to create a new process where I changed the bond policy and I took out what has historically been used in North Carolina and around the country, where you just have a bond chart. You'll just have a corresponding class of felony and a corresponding bond amount. We replaced it with a sort of a decision tree that we ask folks to consider. But the decision tree really is just a process by which we take what the law in North Carolina is and we just reconsider and reformulate how the magistrates and the judges make decisions on who should be released pretrial and those that shouldn't, and if they are detained pretrial, some guidance on what their bond should be. We are not talking about releasing folks that are charged with serious felonies, or we're not talking about releasing folks that are charged with crimes of violence. But what we are talking about are some of these low-level misdemeanors and less serious felonies.
I was totally clueless. That's what I try to help people now, is to navigate through that system, and I try to be the person for people that I wanted when I was in jail.
Pre-trial reform. What do those words mean, Jessie?
Well, it's probably best to talk about what the pretrial system is in North Carolina. All right, well, let's start there. The pretrial system is the part of the criminal justice system that starts when a person's arrested and ends when the person appears in court.
Okay. And so why is there so much buzz around reforming this system?
It's a great question. And there are three basic problems in the system that stakeholders and citizens have begun to understand. And here they are. Number one, the way the current system works undermines public safety. Number two, the way the current system works produces unfairness. And three, the way the current system works is incredibly expensive for taxpayers.
Which of those three do you think really was the genesis for this effort in Haywood and Jackson counties?
I think all of them I think all of them were at issue, but I know that in one of those counties, they do have a jail overcrowding problem. So that was part of the impetus. But also, when I was talking with stakeholders in a process that lasted about 6 months, there were real concerns about the unfairness that was in the system and the research that's developing about how the system undermines public safety was really eye-opening for a lot of folks, including law enforcement. What I'm trying to do in my work in this county and with other communities is basically build a toolbox of evidence-based devices that local jurisdictions can use to fix this system. And this jurisdiction has implemented 5 reforms. We're now in the evaluation phase, and the idea is the ones that come out as doing well, they go in the toolbox.
Will you tell us what those 5 reforms are?
Sure. Well, the first one is new procedures to encourage the use of a citation or a summons instead of an arrest, basically to turn off the spigot of people even coming into the pretrial system. It's basically like you get a notice that says come to court as opposed to being arrested and sitting in jail until your court date. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to make sure that everybody gets a prompt review of their conditions. Right now in North Carolina, if you're charged with a felony, you get a hearing before a judge within 96 hours to look at your conditions. If it's a low-level misdemeanor, you're not entitled to that hearing. And a lot of people charged with these low-level crimes, non-violent crimes, sit in jail for weeks and weeks before a judge ever reviews why they're in jail, and they're often there because they can't pay their bond. So prompt review, judicial review for all folks. Early involvement of counsel in the proceedings. We have an innovative partnership with North Carolina Indigent Defense Services to supply contract counsel to represent the defendants at these really critical first proceedings where their liberty is at stake. Also, they adopted a completely new decision-making framework to figure out what type of conditions people should get and to screen out really early on people that don't need to be incarcerated pre-trial. And finally, they've decided to have detention bond hearings for people who are intentionally detained pretrial to afford them basically a full basket of constitutional protections. It's robust. It's a big set of reforms.
Across the state, county jails are full of people who are waiting for a trial. This has led to jail overcrowding, and it's costing taxpayers millions of dollars. Let's look at the impact of the Haywood County Sheriff's Office, partnering with local groups to save money and lives through reducing the jail population.
I got released from the jail over here in Haywood County. I just pretty much left jail and had no direction of where I was going to go, what I was going to do. Lost all my personal belongings, everything that I had. Lost my wife at the time. I came from having everything to losing everything in like 2 weeks. I met one of the peer support specialists in the jail, and we just kind of started talking, and I gave him my story of how I ended up in jail, why I was there, what I'd hoped to do once I got out of jail, and he thought coming here was a great opportunity for me to do all those things that I needed to do.
We are a faith-based nonprofit. We work with folks who are homeless, and we try to address people's basic needs. Back in July, we're granted an award from the state to be able to have staff that are from Pathways located within the jail. So they are peer support specialists who work with some of the inmates who largely are in for drug charges or they're first-time offenders. We really have to pay attention to caring for the person and looking at what are their life experiences, what trauma has happened, why is it that the drug is a good idea, or where did the mental health issue come from? And then how do we treat those symptoms of the deeper issues so that we really can help people break the cycles and have new foundations to move on to a different kind of life.
With the help of this place, it's made me have faith again that there is a chance for me to rehabilitate, get back out there and be a part of society like I should be. My focus is not to go back to jail. It's not a fun place to be, and just being here, I've met so many different people and heard so many different stories, and it's made me want to change myself.
Jail overcrowding, a topic surprisingly top of mind in many communities in North Carolina. Tara, you hear a lot about this topic. What's the issue?
So I think one of the biggest drivers on jail overcrowding and jail incarceration is obviously the pretrial system. One thing of note that we've come across lately in sort of analyzing this issue is that rural counties are dramatically increasing the number of people they're incarcerating, while some of the more urban districts are sort of stepping back and you know, being a bit more thoughtful about who they put in jail. So there's a project actually at Vera that we've been working with called In Your Backyard, because it's really looking to highlight to people that these are your neighbors. You know, this isn't some huge number that we see about prison incarceration. We're talking about members of your community that are overwhelmingly being thrown into jail.
So let's back up for a second. Why are we seeing increases in the number of people in jail before they have been convicted of a crime?
So the pretrial issue is one that has been really cropping up on both the right and the left in terms of folks paying a lot more attention to it. There's a lot of questions as to what the issues are, how we fix them. I think that there's just, you know, there's some questions as to whether or not it's sort of like the goldfish fits the bowl. Like, if we build more jails, we need to fill them. And so, and we're ever incarcerating. Everything, like, the response to everything is to make a new law, make something more illegal than it was. And so there's just so many different things that people are getting trapped in.
So I want to go back to this really interesting point you made about rural communities seeming to see increased levels of incarceration. What gives there?
It's kind of a shocking figure, and I think it's a lot in large part because people aren't, you know, that so much of our criminal justice reform system people don't pay attention to unless they're wrapped into it, and that's really the importance of the study by Vera. And a lot of the folks on the ground in North Carolina who are looking at this issue are deeply concerned because we don't have a very clear way in which we monitor data of who's in jail, how long, why, if they're on bail. So how can we possibly, you know, respond to the issues when we don't have clear evidence?
What would a local community do in response?
So actually there are local communities that have taken it on themselves. Buncombe County has created a dashboard on pretrial just to retain very clear data on who is in jail, why, you know, what the status of their bond, and in a lot of ways it's led them to self-correct. You know, they didn't realize that there were disparities in the way that certain individuals were being treated, and upon having the access to the data, they immediately began self-correcting. And then Professor Jesse Smith is doing a project in Western North Carolina to sort of create both a better collection of the data, but then also encourage local law enforcement to consider things like citations versus actual arrest when appropriate, so that a person doesn't have to end up in the jail population if, you know, the infraction isn't warranted.
In Haywood County, law enforcement agencies encourage their officers to give citations instead of arrests for low-level offenses. Let's look at the impact of how this helps cut costs and gives officers more time for more pressing duties.
The old adage, we're not going to arrest our way out of this problem, is absolutely so true. People are now being issued citations instead of being arrested for some of these minor offenses. And of course it is still at the discretion of the officer whether that he issues a citation or makes an arrest. We just want to make sure that if the officer or the deputy makes that decision to write a citation, that we end up not having to come back out later on that evening or later on to have to deal with the same problem again.
Generally speaking, those that are detained pretrial tend to plead guilty more often than those that are not.
If you can't make bond for whatever reason, you sit in jail regardless of your innocence or guilt. And so a lot of times, by the time people get to their court date, they just want to enter a plea just to get out. And so with this program, I hope to not be seeing so much of that.
We don't want folks pleading guilty if they're not guilty. And we also don't want folks to forfeit a defense if they feel like they have one. And so accepting a guilty plea when someone may not be guilty or they're only pleading guilty to get out of jail is not what we're here for, and it's not what we stand for.
The relationship that I establish, or I hope that our detention officers establish, and our peer support and our faith-based community that comes in, that we're able to actually show these people the kind of love and the kind of care that they deserve and that they need. And a lot of times, if we will just do that much for a person, it is amazing how that they'll respond and how that they will just completely change.
Pretrial reforms, something you're spending quite a bit of time working on. Susanna, tell us why this is such a big deal.
Sure. So pretrial reform in North Carolina, and I would say around the country right now, is something that a lot of people are talking about. And they're talking about it because money should never determine a person's freedom. But in North Carolina and other states around the country, that is exactly what happens every day. We have people who can pay their bail and get out of jail and go home to their families, go home to their jobs, go home to their children, and come back when it's their time to show up in court and have their day in court. And then we have other people who can't pay their way out of jail and are forced to sit there until their day in court. And those realities are playing out all over the state in a way that's really detrimental for thousands of people.
So how can we both be sure that we're keeping communities safe and not over-incarcerate people who have not yet been adjudicated?
Mm-hmm. Well, I just want to be clear that when we talk about pretrial, we're talking about people who have been charged but not convicted of a crime. And so I think that is an important distinction to remember in these conversations. We're talking about people sitting in jail who may be facing certain charges, but there has been no conviction, there has been no evidence put on by the state to show that this person is in fact the person who committed that crime. Just an example, in North Carolina right now, if we have two individuals who are charged with the exact same crime, let's say you're charged with a failure to disperse. Two people who don't know each other go to a protest. They are both charged with a Class 2 misdemeanor failure to disperse charge, which in most jurisdictions in North Carolina means that they're going to be forced to pay a $500 secured bond. One individual has $500 in their bank account. They can go and get that money out and pay and be released from jail and go back to court when it's their turn to do so. The other person doesn't have $500 in their bank account. They don't have somebody who can lend them that amount of money, so they stay in jail until they wait until their day in court. And I think that sort of disparity and that distinction between those two individuals is really the problem that we're talking about. And we're talking about it all up and down the scale of criminal charges, misdemeanors and felonies.
As a fundamental fairness issue.
As a fundamental fairness issue. You cannot, every day in North Carolina, there are similarly situated people who, but for the amount of money that they have in their bank account, are treated very differently by the system.
What is the answer to a community scratching its head and trying to figure out how do we reform our system so that it's fair to the accused and fair to the community, both in terms of taxpayer dollars? What is the alternative?
I mean, I think that it is incredibly important if a jurisdiction, if a community is looking at something like replacing their current bond schedule with a risk assessment tool. And so if you put in place a risk assessment tool and then 6 months down the road you go back and look at the data and it tells you that although you have implemented this risk assessment tool and more people are getting out of jail on unsecured bonds or written promises to appear before their day in court, but the racial disparities haven't changed or they've in fact gone up, you may want to think about ways and really address how to remedy that.
We all share many of the same challenges in our communities, so why not share the solutions as well? Each and every one of us can make a difference. That's what having an impact is all about.
ncIMPACT is made possible by funding from Civic Federal Credit Union. ncIMPACT is a production of UNC-TV Public Media North Carolina in association with the University of North Carolina School of Government.